Awesome. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the region, I'd like to welcome Nicole Regehr, Interim Executive Director of Gillians Place, as part of the region's commitment to supporting the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. In partnership with many community partners, we are offering a series of education sessions available to the public. So we're very pleased today to be joined by Nicole to learn more about recognizing and responding to intimate partner violence. Just a couple notes before we get started. As the presentation unfolds, please feel free to submit your questions in the comments section. And we will address them at the end of the session today. And a captioned version of this video will be available for viewing on the region's YouTube channel following today's session as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for inviting me to be here today on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which begins the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is very widespread. There are many forms of gendered violence. What we're going to discuss today, though, is intimate partner violence, or what's commonly known as domestic or family violence. What is unique about intimate partner violence is that it's a series of behaviors that used by one person to gain power and control over another. So the motivation for the behaviors, the violence, the abuse, are to maintain power and control over another individual, and oftentimes will only use as much force as is necessary to maintain that control. So in Canada, to give you an overview of kind of the climate of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in Canada, 1 in 3 women will be victims of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. When I first started doing this work about 15 years ago, that number was 1 in 4. So the prevalence of violence is increasing. On any given day in Canada, about 2,500 children are living in violence against women shelters with their mothers. And these children are just as victimized as their mothers. Studies show that witnessing violence is just as damaging long-term as though they experience the violence themselves. 1 to 2 women are murdered by a current or former partner each week. In Ontario alone, we've seen a 47% increase in domestic homicides over the course of the pandemic. And this year alone, 53 women so far this year have lost their lives to intimate partner violence, which is absolutely unacceptable. That's about 5 women per week, or sorry, rather per month in Ontario. In Niagara, the Niagara Regional Police typically respond to an average of 465 domestic violence calls per week. Domestic violence costs our community about $71 million annually. I would say that statistic, that number, dollar value is actually probably much higher. That's kind of an old statistic. But that's for things like medical bills or lost productivity, lost wages. Last year, 305 women and 130 children stayed in Niagara emergency shelters. So there are 3 violence against women shelters in Niagara. One is Gillians Place, where I am from, and that's in St. Catharines, and 1 in Niagara Falls and 1 in Welland. So this is a combined total of women and children that stayed in VAW shelters last year. Over 8,000 crisis calls and texts were answered on our support lines. At Gillian's Place, that was a 41% increase year over year, mostly due to the pandemic. Women were at home, isolated with their abusers, unable to escape. It was actually text support calls that we received most of the increase. It's much easier to text and look for support. That way, it's easier to keep that private from your abuser. And we served over 2,500 women through our critical outreach services. These include things like outreach counseling, legal advocacy and support, transitional housing, and support. So what I want to talk to you about today is recognizing and responding to domestic violence. We noticed a decrease not only because of isolation and stay-at-home orders, but a decrease in the amount of women who were coming into shelter during the pandemic, likely because they were unable to get to some of our typical referral sources. So children weren't going to school, where abuse may be recognized, women weren't attending medical appointments, again, where abuse may be recognized. So 50% of referrals to our organization come from friends and family. So it's very important for you to be able to recognize whether or not some of the risk signs that someone in your life is being abused. So this chart here tells an important part of the story. So if you look at the wide base, you see the most common form of intimate partner violence, that is situational. So on the left, you can see the gender proportions arrow that indicates men and women engage in situations of violence equally. So this kind of violence happens when the couple is responding to something in the situation, and they do so using violence of some kind. As this level of aggression increases, you can see that the gender proportion shifts up to male-dominated violence, and the risk arrow to the right tells you that as the aggression increases, so too does the risk. Violence really exists on a continuum. At the top of the triangle is coercive control, and coercive control is not about responding to a situation. The purpose of this form of violence is to dominate. It's to create fear and psychological dependence. It should also be noted that at the base of the triangle, where the violence is equally perpetrated by men and women experience the most serious injuries and are more likely to be hospitalized. So why do we focus on violence against women? We do know that intimate partner violence happens in all relationships, but the highest risk cases are violence against women cases. They are women experience the most serious injuries. The violence is often preventable, not the violence, but women who lose their lives as the result of intimate partner violence. It's typically predictable. There are risk signs, and so therefore preventable. There is a lifelong impact on children, and we can't change what we can't name. So, the type of systematic violence is widely referred to as domestic violence or family violence. The fact that victims are most often women and children is sometimes hidden. So we can't change what we don't understand. So naming the issue as woman abuse or violence against women is an important development in changing the culture. So to really understand woman abuse, we need to look beyond behaviors to the motivation. And so, like I said, the motivation is always to gain power and control over another person. Often someone using abusive behavior will only use as much force as they have to in order to maintain their control. So they can do this through threats or warnings. Some women often describe to us a look that they receive from their abuser to know that, they better not step out of line. So some forms of abuse or some forms of behaviors of abuse are physical. Those are the most easy to recognize and what people will typically understand when we talk about domestic violence. So slapping, punching, choking, pushing. Sexual, so threats, force used for sexual acts, forcing their partner to engage in sexual acts that are not welcome or wanted. Verbal, so making degrading comments or, again, forced acts. Emotional abuse can include things like confinement, threats to the children, threats to pets. Economic abuse, so stealing, controlling money. Many women who come to our shelter have never had their own bank accounts, their own credit cards, access to any financial means of their own. Also spiritual, so using someone's beliefs to manipulate or control them, not allowing the victim to attend church or synagogue, and stalking. So stalking often happens after someone has tried to leave an abusive relationship. So that's just persistent, unwanted following, watching, digital abuse. Our virtual world has become another means to maintain power and control over a victim, and it's constant and unrelenting. Though abuse really does not discriminate and can happen to anyone, there are some groups where the risk is greater. So Aboriginal women are 5 to 7 times more likely to be killed. There are currently 582 missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. Women with disabilities, 60% of women with disabilities experience some form of violence. Young women, so 66% of all female victims of sexual assault are under the age of 24. Women ages 15 to 24 are 3 times more likely to experience violence than any other age group. Immigrant women don't necessarily experience higher rates, but may be more vulnerable because of economic dependence, language barriers, and lack of knowledge of community services. We had a woman with us recently who said, where she came from, shelters weren't a thing. Violence against women shelters weren't something that even existed. And so she was here for quite some time before she was referred to our services, and said she would have come much sooner had she known that there were services available to her or a safe space for her to come to. Also, women in rural communities, and this is really mostly around isolation, lack of transportation, long response time for police. There typically tends to be more firearms in the home in rural communities, and women in rural communities have responsibility sometimes for, if they live on a farm, they have responsibility for livestock, and so it's not as easy to escape their situation when they have that kind of responsibility. So what do you need to know? So we're going to talk about how you can identify women at risk of abuse, some of the warning signs, some warning signs that a situation is high risk, meaning that there may be a high risk of lethality, and some safety planning tips that you can keep in mind to help a loved one or yourself, and what services are available to women in our community. So often women who are experiencing abuse won't directly tell you what's happening, and they may not even recognize it as abuse themselves, especially if it's not physical. But you might notice some warning signs that make you wonder what's going on. So this list of warning signs can help you identify situations that may be abusive. If you suspect abuse, it's important to ask questions and not to jump to conclusions. And these signs don't automatically mean a person is experiencing abuse, but they are red flags that tell us something's not right. So if you notice that, someone may be being put down a lot by their partner, or their partner does all of the talking and dominates conversations, if you're out with a friend and their partner is constantly calling or texting them, checking up on them all the time, even when they're at work, if the abuser tries suggesting that they are the victim, and may even act depressed. Abusers often try and isolate their victims. In fact, it's almost sometimes a necessary tactic to maintain power and control over their victim. So if you notice friends or family members becoming isolated, they don't call you as often or come to visit, that's definitely a warning sign that abuse is happening. Sometimes you will see where someone acts as if they own their partner, or that their actions, they need to ask permission to leave the house, or to go get groceries, go out with friends. Oftentimes abusers will lie to make themselves look good, or they'll exaggerate their good qualities to try and hide their abusive tendencies. And oftentimes abusers act like they are superior and more valuable than others in their home, even their children, oftentimes. You'll notice victims are often apologetic and they make excuses for their partner's behavior. So if you're out and somebody's partner is being rude or starting arguments, oftentimes their partner will try and de-escalate the situation make excuses for them, like, they're just really stressed out about work, or some other excuse to explain away the behavior. Victims are often nervous talking to others when their abuser is present, afraid that they may say something wrong. Victims tend to be sick more often and miss work. So if you're noticing, a colleague suddenly starts to miss a lot of work that is unexplained, that may be a warning sign. Victims typically, if they have physical injuries, will try and cover up or make excuses for any physical injuries or bruises. Oftentimes, if you make plans with a friend and they tend to cancel at last minute, often that can be also a warning sign that abuse is happening. Victims may seem lonely, sad, withdrawn. Someone who may have otherwise been outgoing is suddenly withdrawn and subdued. Victims often turn to drugs or alcohol to cope. So oftentimes, with abuse comes mental health and addictions issues. And, like I said, bumps and bruises are definitely the most obvious and the most recognizable forms of abuse, but certainly not the only forms of abuse, and not the most dangerous. So we do, with everybody who reaches out to Gillian's Place, we do what's called a Jackie Campbell danger assessment. And what that assessment does is assesses the risk of lethality. During the course of the pandemic, we noticed not only an increase in the prevalence of violence, but the severity of violence by 37%. So 37% more women were scoring higher on the danger assessment over the course of the pandemic. So some signs of a high risk of lethality are when an abuser has access to the victim and their children, that the abuser has access to weapons, or has a history of abuse with the victim or with other people, threats to kill the victim if they leave. We've all heard this before: if I can't have you, no one will. If the abuser threatens to harm the victim's children, pets, or property, has threatened to kill themselves, has hit and or choked a victim. Choking is a very is a real sign of risk of lethality, and going through major life changes. So if the abuser has recently lost their job, or the separation between the victim and the abuser has just happened, that's a very dangerous time. If the abuser is going through a bout of depression, if the abuser is convinced that the victim is seeing someone else, whether or not they actually are, that's another sign of risk. The abuser blames the victim for ruining their life, or the abuser won't do anything to seek any help. So if somebody is behaving abusively and these high risk signs are present, there's a greater danger that he will do something to seriously harm or even kill their partner or ex-partner. Other signs of risk are the abuser watches the victim's actions, listens to telephone conversations, reads their email. If they're not together anymore, if they have separated, is stalking or following their victim. If the abuser has trouble keeping a job, again, that's a sign of a change of a major life event. Abuses drugs or alcohol and is not afraid of the law, doesn't have respect for the law. If the victim has just separated or is planning to leave, that is actually the most dangerous time for a woman. We get often asked, why doesn't she just leave? It's because the victim knows that there is an increased risk immediately following separation. The victim fears for their life or their children's safety. So oftentimes it's just this innate fear. Women have intuition, and if your intuition is telling you that you're in danger, you probably are. If there's a custody battle happening, or there are children from a previous relationship, that's another sign of high risk. If the victim has new unexplained injuries, they don't have access to a phone or other means of communication, or if they face other obstacles, like they don't speak English, they're a new resident to Canada, they live in a remote area, some of those other high risk factors that we talked about earlier, or the victim is isolated, they don't have friends or family that they can count on. So we have in Canada something called the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, and they have found that in almost 80% of cases where women are killed, there were 7 or more risk factors that were present. And those are the ones listed here. So a history of domestic violence, actual or pending separation, obsessive behavior, depression of the perpetrator, the level of violence is increasing. There are prior threats of or attempts of suicide, prior attempts to isolate the victim. Again, that victim had the intuitive sense of fear, and the perpetrator is unemployed. So this list here shows the most common risk factors in cases reviewed by the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. And so if you see any of these present in a situation, it's very important that you encourage your friend or family member to reach out for help. If there's immediate danger, always call 911. So you may be wondering what you can do to help. So as I mentioned, in any abusive relationship, isolation is really a key factor. So isolation of the victim, the abuser, the children, friends and family members, as a situation gets worse, as it inevitably does with some kind of intervention, the isolation intensifies. People become more and more alone, and often the abuse escalates. So we're going to go 2 more ahead. So what we want to do as bystanders is interrupt that isolation. So there's 3 things that we can do. And if you take away anything today, this is the thing that you want to take.
All right, we apologize, just had experienced some technical difficulties, but we're back and I'll turn it back over to Nicole.
Thank you. So as I was saying, if there's anything you take away from today, it is this, and that is see it, name it, check it. And the it that we're referring to are okay, so we're back again. We're going to take these one by one. So the first is see it. So if you see a warning sign, it's like seeing the tip of an iceberg. So there's likely much more abusive behavior going on that you may never see. And so that's why it's so important to take warning signs seriously. If something doesn't seem right, it's probably because it isn't. So you need to learn the warning signs, pay attention to the people around you, and treat your suspicions and concerns seriously. The next is to name it. So you want to name your concern to yourself and to other people, and just the facts. So what did you see? I heard him yelling at you, or he calls you constantly to check up on you. I am worried about you because I heard him yelling at you again. And the last is to check it. You want to check your assumptions. You want to ask yourself, am I making an assumption, or did I actually see or hear something that isn't right? If you're not sure, call us, call Gillian's Place. We're available 24 hours, 7 days a week, not only to those who are experiencing violence, but for family members and friends who care about them and are looking for advice. You can say, I noticed that you need to ask your partner for money. That's a warning sign of abuse. Do you experience any of these other things? Always, if someone is in immediate danger, always call the police first. But you can always say to somebody, are you okay? Do you want to talk? And really, your genuine concern is the key that'll open the door. So don't worry about getting the words exactly right. That's not the most important thing. Your concern for your friend or family member's well-being will be evident, and that'll open the door to the conversation. Again, a lot of questions, question we get asked often are, why doesn't the victim just leave? And there are many ways. Seeing, naming it, checking it, that's not a magic solution. You can't ever expect that your conversation will make a woman leave her partner or reach out to an agency like Gillian's Place. And unless you've lived in an abusive situation, when you ask, why doesn't she just leave? When we ask that question, we're really blaming her. And it's not her fault. It's not the victim's fault. And it's not supportive to push somebody into doing something that they're not ready to do. So, though you may see the abuse, that the abuse is happening, you cannot expect that somebody will leave right away, because what the victim knows is that when they leave, it's the most dangerous time for them. And there are other things that need to be considered. Someone may be afraid to be on their own. They have nowhere to go, especially, those who may be immigrants to our country. They have no family or friends, and they're very isolated here. Family pressure. So, oftentimes, there'll be family pressure. They don't see the abuse. You may be getting a pressure from the abuser's family to stay. Again, that isolation. And also, just because somebody's being abused doesn't mean that they don't love their partner. Nobody wants to be abused. They want their partner to stop abusing them. There's also still, unfortunately, some shame and embarrassment that comes with being in an abusive relationship. Though it's certainly, what is happening to a victim is never their fault, never their children's fault. You can still feel that shame and embarrassment, and that's an obstacle to leaving as well. If there's been a history of abuse, a lot of times, if you've grown up in an abusive household, where perhaps your mother was abused by your father, that's what you've seen, that's what you've learned, and that's normal to you. We know that children who grow up in abusive homes will are much more likely to either become victims themselves or abusers themselves when they get older. So it's they're living what they've learned. There's of course a fear that there will be further harm or more serious danger to the victim or their children for leaving. Also children, when you have children who are in school or who have activities, you have a whole community around you, very difficult. And it's a really big deal to uproot your whole lives, move your children perhaps into a shelter where they need to change schools. Oftentimes, we tend to get busier in the summer or during holiday times when children are in school, where it's easier to make that move. There are many cultural or religious reasons why people may stay in abusive relationships. I had a woman tell me once that she actually went to her pastor for advice, and she was being very seriously physically abused, and her pastor told her she needed to go home and work it out. And she had so much respect and so embedded in her religion and in her church that that was the advice that she took. She went home and tried to work it out, and it almost cost her life. Also, women, if they're not being physically abused, may wonder or not understand that the abuse is happening. But things like emotional abuse, financial abuse, isolation, gaslighting, all of these things, they leave scars. They may not be physical, but they leave long-lasting scars and are just as harmful to someone's well-being. and of course, economic uncertainty or poverty. So, many victims of intimate partner violence don't work. They've never been permitted to have a job. They have perhaps no education. So it's like, I can leave, but how am I going to support myself? And if they have children, how am I going to support my children? And especially in uncertain times like the one we're living in now, it becomes increasingly more difficult to be able to, see ahead to where you may be able to be on your journey to safety and independence. So now that we understand the obstacles to leaving, even if a woman is choosing to stay in her relationship for a number of reasons, and many of which we've just seen on the next screen, it's important for all victims to have a safety plan in place, whether or not they're in the relationship or not. So, there are professionals in most communities that help with safety planning. In St. Catharines in North Niagara, that's Gillian's Place. But if you live outside Niagara, the Assaulted Women's Helpline is somewhere you can call to find a shelter in your area to do safety planning. And we do safety planning not only with victims, family members, and friends, again, looking to support and keep their family member or friends safe. But you should also understand basics of safety planning. We have a resource on our website. You can also request more information about safety planning, but every women's situation is unique. And so when we're safety planning with the women, we do it with children as well. We're looking at individualized situations. And so the goal, when you are helping a loved one or a friend, is not always to get them to leave. It's about keeping them safe. So if a woman's not ready to leave her abuser, we want to do everything that we can to make sure that we keep her and her children, if she has any, as safe as possible during the time that she's remaining in the relationship, as well as when they leave. On the flip side, if someone you care about is acting abusively, you can choose to speak to them as well. But it's important to understand, though, that I'm not advocating for you to confront abusive men or challenge people that you don't know. But if your brother or your best friend or an uncle were behaving abusively to their partner, you may be the best person to have the conversation and suggest that they get help. So if that's something that you choose to do, it's important not to take a confrontational attitude, which may be understandable, but rarely effective. We know that without some kind of intervention, abusive behavior is likely to escalate. So figuring out how to intervene safely and effectively can be a challenge. You can call our support line first if you find yourself in a situation where you want to talk to somebody, but you're not sure what to say. And if you're somebody who uses abusive behavior, don't be afraid to reach out for help yourself. There are organizations there to help and programs available in our community to assist abusive men. But some things that you can say to somebody that you care about that might be acting abusively, first of all, you want to approach when they're calm. Tell them that you're concerned. Recognize that confrontational, argumentative approaches may make the situation worse. There are some resources available, and there's a good book that explores the reality of abusive men, and it's written by Lundy Bancroft, and it's called Why Does He Do That? And I know it's available at our libraries here in St. Catharines. So if you get to a place where you or a loved one are ready to reach out for help, what we can do at Gillian's Place to help, we really do, we're a holistic agency that provides all of the services that somebody needs to move on from violence to living safely and independently. Our mission at Gillian's Place is to work with and empower people experiencing gender-based violence by providing safety and support through a variety of services and raising awareness about the root causes and the cycle to end violence and abuse. Our vision is to be a socially just and equitable community where all are free from gender-based violence. So at Gillian's Place, a lot of us know us by our 24-hour emergency shelter. We're quite a grand space in St. Catharines. And that's important for those who need the safety of our shelter. We're a 34-bed shelter for women and children. We also offer transitional shelters. So for folks who need a little bit of extra time, we provide second stage housing in St. Catharines and in West Niagara. And that's really intensive support. Women and families can stay in our second stage units up to 3 years, where they receive very intensive hand-over-hand support until they're in a place where they're ready to move on to living in a more permanent situation independently. But it's about safety and making sure that we, when women move into independent spaces, that they're prepared. We don't want to see a recurrence of violence. We offer support for children. So both children who are residing in our shelter, right now we have 20 of them, but also for children who are living in the community. As I said earlier, it's just as traumatizing for children to witness abuse as if they were experiencing it themselves, and there can be real lifelong trauma. And so our job at Gillian's Place is to help children deal with that trauma in a safe way, and get past that so that we don't see that cycle of violence continue for another generation. We also offer legal services. One of our most important programs, we employ a family law lawyer who advocates for our clients both in the family court and criminal court system. So, oftentimes a barrier for women leaving, they've been told that if they leave, they'll lose their children or they won't receive any financial support. So being able to have a lawyer on staff that can speak to our clients and let them know what their rights are is very empowering. And because she's a lawyer, it opens up many doors for us to advocate within the justice system for victims of gender-based violence in our community. We do safety planning with everyone who calls our support line, anyone who comes in for an appointment, or anybody who is residing in our shelter. Our main objective is always to keep women and children safe. We offer experienced and non-judgmental domestic violence related counseling. Again, that is for women both residing in our shelter and for those in our community. We do things like this. We provide public education. It's so important. And I said earlier today, violence breeds in silence, and it really does. It's that isolation. So the more that we can talk about it, the more we can educate people to recognize warning signs and be able to respond to situations of domestic violence, the more we can work toward our vision, which is that we're out of business, that we don't need to exist anymore. The other thing that we provide is transitional housing support. So that's a program that helps women really with anything that helps them transition into living independently. So for some, that means learning how to access public transportation. For some, it's educational upgrading. For some, it's accessing finances through Ontario Works or ODSP. We make connections with schools. If children need to move schools, we make sure that there's a safety plan in place, that the school understands what's happening, so that we can keep children safe while they're at school too. And we provide all of these services. They're free, they're completely confidential, and we provide them in an accessible space and provide translation services in all languages. So we really try to be very barrier-free. But if you ever have any questions about any of our services or what it might be like to live in shelter, I know during times of the pandemic, the thought of moving into a communal space can be very frightening. You're afraid, not only afraid of the situation that you're leaving or the unknown nature of what you might be heading into, but also now afraid of the virus. So, it's always a nice idea to give us a call and we can explain what measures we have in place to protect not only your safety, but your health as well. So again, reducing isolation always increases safety. So the more we can do to reduce isolation, the safer we make it for women and children. And change can happen in everyday ways. We all have a role to play in creating the safe, supportive communities that we all want to live and work in. If we all just use our existing networks of relationships to spread the information and generate discussion on this very complex issue, eventually we'll achieve our goals. And so for every person that takes any action of any kind, it's really impossible to know who will be affected. And the little things count. I always say, if we help one woman today, that's good enough for me. So it all counts. All the little things matter. The more people you talk to, you don't know how widespread that's going to go and who's going to hear it that really needs to hear it. And somebody, may find out, today there's, likely somebody watching who may reach out and their life may change just because of these little actions. So leaving today, a few things to remember. You really don't need to be a hero. You don't need to fix the situation. Just being somebody, a safe person for your friend or family member to talk to, someone who can provide advice, let them know how to get help, just caring about the people around us, paying attention to them when there's any signs of trouble, recognizing those warning signs, letting them know in a safe way where and how they can reach out for help. Again, all of those little things count. So we can take any questions now. We'll leave our support line up on the screen here. And also our website is a great resource. So today, the information I've given is very high level. There's certainly more information that you can access on our website, or again, call our 24-hour support line at any time for information or support for you or a loved one.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole.
You're welcome.
I believe we're going to turn to questions. Maybe just to get us started. I know you spoke a little bit about how domestic violence has changed over the course of the pandemic, not only some of the measures that you had to put in place to ensure women were safe within shelter, within accessing your programs, but also domestic violence trends itself looked a little bit different in the community. Just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that for those at home.
Yeah, so what we noticed right at the start of the pandemic, as soon as we went into isolation and stay-at-home orders, the number of women and children in our shelter decreased quite significantly. And we knew right away we could attribute that to women being at home with their abuser. They weren't able to find that physical space to leave. So typically, when folks are coming to our shelter, they're doing it with their partners at work or gone to the grocery store. They weren't able to do that. So we noticed a dramatic increase, especially in our text support calls. We also noticed when women were coming to shelter and were reaching out to us, the severity of their injuries increased. And like I said, but 30% of women that were assessed through the Jackie Campbell Danger Assessment had a much increased level of risk and injuries, and that was widespread. So there were surveys done with shelters across Canada, across Ontario, and frontline workers were reporting that across the board, that not only the prevalence of violence, but the severity of the violence. It was a pressure cooker situation. Anxiety was up. People were afraid of the virus. They were afraid of, losing their income. We're stuck at home together. Even, the best of relationships, that can be difficult, right? So it was a real pressure cooker. We're noticing now as isolation measures eased and things kind of went back to normal. Since that happened, we have been consistently full. So during this time, it was like the violence and the abuse was escalating and getting worse. And then when women were finally able to find that space to leave, they were. So we have been, consistently full. We're experiencing a demand in our service like we have never seen before. All of our programs are at top capacity. We have waiting lists where we've never had that before. We're rapidly expanding to meet the demand, hiring extra staff. It's been economically, financially challenging for our organization to meet the demand. But of course, we're striving and working to do that. We are in a situation now where we need to renovate and expand so that we can meet the demand in all of our programs and the changing needs of our clientele. So, the pandemic was really perfect storm for abuse, and we're definitely seeing the impact of that now.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we have other questions. So I see from a viewer, Cassie Lynn. Do you partner with any of the multicultural centers to provide information to new immigrants on BAW services in Niagara?
So it's very important to us to partner with other community agencies so that we can assure that our programs and services are culturally appropriate and responsive. We want to meet women where they are and provide service in the way that is most appropriate for them. So we do partner with many, the Multicultural Center in St. Catharines, as well as other agencies in our region, the Niagara Regional Native Center, and we are always striving and looking for new partnerships. You know, if there's an agency out there, someone watching today that would like to partner with us and offer services or support to us for other marginalized communities, we're certainly always open to that. But we definitely look to the experts in our region to help us support women in the way that they need to be supported.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question from Cassie Lynn. How could members of the public support Gillian's Place?
There are so many ways. First, you know, awareness. Talk about what you learned today. Tell everybody that you know. Talk about those warning signs. Let people know where they can find help. You know, we are about 70% funded through the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. The other we have to fundraise for, and like I said, we're rapidly expanding. We are heading into a capital campaign. We are renovating our internal spaces to add extra bedrooms, more programming space. We're putting an addition on our building. And so financial support is always so gratefully appreciated and accepted. And you can learn on our website ways that you can support our organization financially. We have had our volunteer program on hold for the last year and a half, but we are in a position now where we would love to welcome our very valued volunteers back into our shelter. And there are many ways to volunteer with us, both in our shelter as well as, you know, administratively or out in the community. So there are several ways that you can support the women that we serve through philanthropy or volunteerism.
Wonderful, thank you. A question from Shalini Hamalal. What can you do if you express your concerns towards the potential victim and you experience confrontation from both the victim and abuser in response to this? How can you balance not isolating the victim with protecting one's own safety?
So it's actually very common. Oftentimes when police respond to calls of domestic violence, it seems that the victim is the, you know, irrational one or the, you know, emotional one, and the abuser is able to, you know, maintain calm and seem like, you know, the rational person in the relationship. And it's often, you know, for a victim, it's very difficult to recognize that that abuse is happening. And when someone calls it out, you know, there is, like I said, still some shame and guilt surrounded by that. Also, you know, the victim may love their partner and they want to, it suddenly becomes this thing where they want to protect their partner. And it's all very normal. The very best thing you can do to support, you know, a loved one, let them know that you recognize the abuse. I would never try to confront a situation, you know, with both partners there. Find a safe way to do it, to talk to your loved one. Let them know, again, you see it, you name it, you check it. You let them know, this is what I see. This is a warning sign of abuse. I know that the abuse is happening. Just know that I'm a safe person that you can come to. This is a safe line that you can call anonymously. But you know, you need to be able to respect where that person is at that present time. So you can't always expect, you know, because you've reached out and recognized the abuse, that that person will be ready to leave their situation. But you want to let them know that you will be there for them when they're ready to do it and leading up to that. So if someone's not ready to leave, if you're speaking with somebody and you know, they're getting agitated as the victim, the very best thing that you could do is just let them know that you're there to support them when and if they need to talk.
Great, thank you. I think you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but if you could just cover again, how is Gillians Place funded?
So we're again partially funded through a provincial funder, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, and the rest is fundraised. So we do a few events during the year, but mostly from the support of grant funders and our very generous community of corporate and individual donors. We're able to offer the essential free confidential services that we do.
Wonderful, thank you. I think you spoke a little bit about sort of Gillian's Place plans to expand services. I'm wondering if there are, you offer quite a few services in the community, from sort of like legal guidance and support to counseling. Is there one area that you feel like there is a particular gap in Niagara that requires sort of further investment, or is it more generally across the board?
Yeah, I mean, right now what's important for us, and one of our most underfunded programs, is our second stage family program. And so that's where I talked about, we have some second stage housing units where folks really receive intensive support. So oftentimes, we see, people coming back, they leave our shelter, but they can't maintain employment or housing. They can't find employment or housing. So it's a longer term solution where, women and children learn life skills and they get to a point where they're able to live independently. This program is supported 100% through grant funding. And so, we really want to see that program sustained. And so there's a real gap there for funding. We also don't receive any funding at all for public education or prevention. So until we put a real investment in prevention, we're just going to keep spinning our wheels, and we're going to continue to be a Band-Aid on the solution, which is wonderful. We're here for women who need us. We're literally saving lives. But, we want to get to a place where we're preventing. We don't want to be reactive anymore. We want to prevent the violence before it happens.
That makes sense to us, definitely. I believe we're now at the last call for questions. We just received, I think maybe our final question for today from Stacy. If a woman does not want to enter shelter but needs help, can she obtain counseling as a quote-unquote outpatient?
Absolutely. And you never need to spend a day in our shelter to access all of our services. Every service we offer is available on an outreach basis and can be accessed centrally through our 24-hour support line. We have an intake line where we'll be able to connect you with the appropriate service in our organization. But no, certainly it is available to everybody on an outreach basis as well.
Wonderful. And sorry, now we're at our last question here. Does Gillian Place have outreach workers who can see a woman in community?
So right now we have 2 offices where we can accommodate appointments for women, and we also offer virtual appointments as well. If it's safer for you to, meet at Tim Hortons, that's something that you can discuss with our counselors on your support line as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great. Thanks everyone who is viewing our live stream and submitting your questions. You'll see the link at the bottom of the screen to Gillian's Place to learn more about the programs and services they offer. We'll also just share, as part of our 16 days for activism against gender-based violence, Nicole will be moderating a film screening and panel discussion at the First Ontario Performing Arts Centre on December 5th. We will be streaming Beyond December 6th, which sort of explores from a survivor's perspective the Montreal massacre, where as we know, 14 women's lives were lost on that day in Montreal. So thanks for joining us, Nicole, today. Very much helpful in terms of supporting, residents in Niagara, regional staff, council, those tuning in today on how to recognize and respond effectively when we see intimate partner violence in our community. So thank you for joining us.